Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing stories ever to come out of the forgotten depths of Appalachia. Please comment on where you are watching from right now, because this story will affect you in ways you didn't expect. This video is made up and is only meant to be funny. Any similarities to real people, living or dead, are completely accidental. Picture a quiet valley in the West Virginia mountains, where mist floats between old pine trees, and the silence is so thick it feels like it's weighing you down. A geologist decided to write down the rock formations in this area that had hardly been explored in 1902. Edmund Whitmore was a middle-aged man who was obsessed with making a list of every cave and crack in the earth that could tell him something about the geological past. He had left his comfortable life in Pittsburgh to go into that wild area with only kerosene lanterns, leather notebooks, and a curiosity that was almost reckless. The locals called the area the Valley of Oblivion, and the name was more true than poetic. Not many people went there because the trails were dangerous and twisted through ravines where a single wrong step could mean death. Edmund didn't care about comfort or safety. He wanted something bigger that would make his name known in the history of science. This desire drove him to the entrance of a cave that wasn't on any maps. The cave's mouth looked like a wound in the side of the mountain. It was partly hidden by thick plants and rocks that looked like they had been put there on purpose to keep people away. As he got closer, Edmund felt a chill run down his back. There was something more than just the temperature that dropped a lot there. His rational mind tried to ignore it, but his gut told him to turn back. He turned on his flashlight anyway, even though it was a silent warning. The first few meters were narrow, so he had to twist and turn between stone walls that were always wet and dripping. The sound of his boots hitting the uneven floor made a creepy rhythm, as if the cave itself were breathing. Edmund carefully wrote down everything, including the width of the passages and samples of minerals that shone faintly in the light of his flashlight. But everything changed for the expedition when they got to the first chamber. The room was huge, and the ceiling disappeared into the dark above. Stalactites hung down like pointing fingers, and the floor was covered in a thin layer of something that Edmund thought was dust at first. He bent down to get a better look and saw that it was ash. Not volcanic ash or ash from natural erosion, but ash from something that had been burned. And there, carved into the walls with disturbing accuracy, were marks that were clearly not made by nature. Symbols, hundreds or maybe thousands of them, covering every inch of the stone. Some were geometric, others organic, and some looked like shapes that Edmund couldn't name, but made his stomach feel very bad. He spent hours drawing those symbols in his notebook. His hands shook not because it was cold, but because he was excited and scared at the same time. He knew that this wasn't the work of native people. The method, the accuracy, and even the choice of that faraway place all pointed to something else, something that was meant to be hidden. While he was looking around the chamber, Edmund saw that the markings looked like they were telling a story. They moved from one wall to another in ways that made it seem like they were telling a story or moving through time. In the middle of the biggest wall, there was one symbol that stood out from all the others. A complicated spiral that looked like it had been burned into the rock with impossible intensity. When Edmund touched that mark, he felt something strange. A vibration that was almost too small to notice that went up his arm. He instinctively pulled back. That's when he saw the passage. There was a smaller opening, even smaller than the first one, hidden behind a group of stalagmites. The air that came from there was different, with a metallic smell that made his eyes hurt. Edmund knew he had to stop there, write down what he had found, and come back with a team. But the passage drew him in like a magnet, as if something on the other side were calling his name at frequencies that only his soul could hear. He squeezed through the opening, leaving the first chamber, which was safer than the second. The tunnel went down at a steep angle, and Edmund had to hold on to the rock ledges to keep from slipping. The flashlight swung back and forth violently, making shadows dance that messed with his mind. He was sure he saw movement ahead more than once, shapes that disappeared as soon as the light hit them. Every meter he walked made it harder for him to breathe. It wasn't because he wasn't getting enough oxygen. It was because the pressure in his chest was getting worse, as if the mountain were closing in on him. Edmund found something at the bottom of the tunnel that went against everything he knew about science. A second chamber, smaller than the first but much more disturbing. There were no symbols on the walls here. They were too smooth and polished to be natural. There was a structure in the middle of the room that made Edmund doubt his own sanity. The structure was a column of black stone that didn't seem to reflect the light from the flashlight. Edmund walked around the monolith carefully, trying to figure out where it came from. There were no signs of tools used to shape or move it. The stone was just there, as if it had grown from the cave floor itself. It felt strangely warm to the touch, with a subtle heat that was different from the cold, damp air around it. Edmund saw that the floor had been dug out in a perfect circle around the base of the column. There were things inside this round hole that made his heart race. Old tools, some of which were made of corroded metal that he couldn't identify, and others of petrified wood that made him think they were from a time that was impossible. There were also pieces of fabric that fell apart at the slightest touch, and ceramic pots with designs that were similar to the symbols in the last room. But the manuscripts were what really caught his eye. There were pages and pages of thick writing, wrapped in something that looked like leather, but felt like nothing Edmund had ever felt before. The ink had held up unnaturally well over time, staying black and readable even after what were clearly decades, maybe even centuries, of being ignored. Edmund's hands shook as he picked up one of the manuscripts and started to look at it. The language was a strange mix of Old Latin and something he didn't know, but the way it was put together made it possible for him to figure out bits and pieces. What he was able to translate scared him to the core. The text said that a group had taken refuge in those mountains in 1847 to escape persecution that the manuscripts described in vague but scary terms. They weren't just normal people. They were part of a secret society that practiced what they called profound science. This was a mix of observing nature and doing rituals that society at the time thought were wrong. They had picked that cave as a safe place to study and work, where they could do their work without being judged. Edmund read about experiments with rare minerals found only in that part of the Appalachians. They thought these minerals could change things. The manuscripts talked about how to distill things, how to mix elements to get glowing reactions, and how some stones seemed to react to people being around them. There were complicated diagrams that showed how the mountain was built, mapped veins of minerals that Edmund didn't know about, and even deeper chambers that he hadn't found yet. But the last part of the manuscripts he was able to read really bothered the scientist. The tone of the texts changed and became more frantic. The writer seemed to be in a hurry or under a lot of emotional stress, so the words were less carefully written. They talked about discoveries that were better than they had hoped for and something they had found deep in the earth. Edmund couldn't fully understand the descriptions because they were too vague. However, there was one phrase that was repeated several times in the last pages, written in different languages, as if the author wanted to make sure that anyone who might find those documents would understand it. "Don't go any further down" was a simple but scary phrase. Edmund felt a chill run through his whole body. He looked past the black stone column and finally saw what his mind had been refusing to see until then. There was another opening in the wall across from him, an irregular hole that went down at an almost vertical angle. The air that came out of it was unlike anything he had ever smelled before. It had a smell that wasn't quite bad, but was deeply wrong, as if it were the smell of time itself rotting. Edmund's desire to learn about science fought against his need to stay alive. Every part of his mind that was reasonable told him to write down what he had found and leave right away. But the part of him that had always wanted to know more, that had made him give up a safe job to explore forgotten places, whispered that the real discovery was further down. The manuscripts were just the beginning. The depths were waiting for whatever that secret group had found. He walked up to the hole and threw a rock inside. The sound of the stone hitting the bottom took too long to come back, which means it fell several meters. Edmund tied his climbing rope to a strong ledge and pulled on it to see how strong it was. The rope was strong. It had worked well in other caves where people had gone down. But deep down, he knew this one would be different. It felt like something important would change and could never be changed back once they crossed that line. Edmund started to go down with his flashlight attached to his belt and his notebook safely stored in his backpack. The wall of the pit was surprisingly smooth, making it hard to find places to hold on. He slowly let himself slide down the rope, using his hands to control his descent. The friction was already starting to make his hands burn. His flashlight's light barely reached the darkness below, showing only bits of rock face that rushed by his field of vision. The temperature rose as he went deeper. It wasn't the humid heat of deep caves that he was used to. It was a dry, almost feverish heat that made his skin tingle. Edmund started to hear sounds he couldn't place, like distorted echoes that could be running water or something else. His mind started to play tricks on him, making patterns in the sound chaos and turning random noises into something that sounded like voices, like whispers coming from the depths. Edmund needed a few moments to get his balance back when his feet finally hit solid ground. He had never seen a room like the one he was in before. The ceiling curved up into a natural dome, and the walls glowed with a pale green light that wasn't coming from his flashlight. There were thousands of crystals in the rock, like stars that had been frozen in time. They gave off their own light, which was weak but steady, making the room feel like a dream and making Edmund wonder if he was still awake. He walked slowly through the room, fascinated by the shapes the crystals made. They weren't random, he suddenly understood. They followed certain lines that led to the center of the room, where something completely caught his eye. A stone table made with great care and surrounded by benches made from living rock. Things were carefully placed on the table, as if someone had just left and was getting ready to come back at any moment. There were glass containers with liquids inside that still had bright colors, which didn't make any sense in terms of preservation. There were tools that looked like scientific tools but had uses that Edmund couldn't think of. And there were more manuscripts. These were in better shape than the last ones, and the diagrams were so detailed that they seemed to jump off the pages. Edmund moved his flashlight closer and started to look at the papers with the focus of someone who knows they are about to see something amazing. The texts showed that the group had done a lot more research than Edmund had thought they would. They had found out that the crystals in that room reacted to people being there by sending out frequencies that changed how people saw time and space. The manuscripts talked about experiments in which group members spent hours meditating in front of the crystals and seeing visions of far-off places and times that had not yet come. Some people said they could see the mountain's future, watching it slowly erode over thousands of years. But the text said that a problem was getting worse. The longer they were around the crystals, the harder it was to tell what was real and what was a vision. People in the group started to tell different stories about what they had seen, each one seeing a different future or past. People talked about what they were seeing. Were they real glimpses of other realities, or just hallucinations caused by some chemical property of the crystals? Edmund listened to every word with a mix of scientific doubt and growing interest. Some of him wanted to ignore it as the rantings of people who had been alone for too long, but another part of him, the part that had felt something strange since entering that cave, knew those stories were true. He had felt that vibration in the symbol of the first chamber, the feeling that the mountain was somehow alive, breathing, and watching. The manuscripts went on to say how the group had decided to go even deeper. What did you think would be at the very bottom of the earth if the crystals in that chamber had those kinds of properties? They had found signs of lower chambers and heard sounds that made them think there were huge spaces hidden below their feet. Some members of the group thought it was a bad idea, but they all agreed to dig to get to levels that nature had kept hidden for a very long time. Edmund stopped writing and used his flashlight to look around the room until he found what he was looking for. There was a hole in the farthest wall that was clearly not natural. The edges were too straight and the angles were too sharp. It was partly hidden by a natural curtain of stalactites. Someone had used tools and determination to carve this out, and unlike the other passages, this one had been purposely blocked with rocks that were stacked in a way that made them unstable. It was as if someone had tried to seal that path quickly, without the time or money to do a permanent job. He walked slowly, and with each step, he felt the temperature drop a lot. The crystals didn't shine in that area, so it was surrounded by a darkness that seemed thicker and more real. Edmund started to take away the stones that were blocking the way. Each stone he took away revealed more of the opening that had been carved into the rock. The air that came out of there was cold and smelled like metal again, but stronger, almost like it was going to kill you. Edmund hesitated when he finally had enough room to get through. The last manuscripts he read stopped in the middle of a sentence, as if the writer had been suddenly interrupted. There was no answer to what had happened to the group or why they had left their carefully organized tools and papers behind. There was no life in the room above, but there were no signs of a fight or a desperate escape. It was like they all made a choice to go down and never come back. Edmund lit up the blocked path. The tunnel was narrow and not very well dug, and the tool marks were still visible on the walls. He could tell that the tunnel went down at a slight angle and then disappeared into the dark after a few meters. There was something very wrong with that place that made every instinct in his body scream for him to run away. But Edmund Whitmore had come too far to give up now. He checked his flashlight, adjusted his backpack, and went into the dugout tunnel. The room was so small that he had to bend over to move forward. The walls looked like they were pulsing in the light of his flashlight. Or maybe his tired eyes were just playing tricks on him. He tried to keep track of how far he had gone by counting his steps in his head, but he quickly lost track. The tunnel seemed to go on forever, with each meter looking the same as the last. This made him feel like he wasn't moving, just walking in place while the darkness moved around him. Then, all of a sudden, the tunnel opened up into a room that was nothing like what Edmund had expected. It wasn't a room like the others. It was a huge hole that was so big that the light from his flashlight barely reached the other walls. The ceiling went up into the pitch blackness above, and the floor was perfectly flat, too smooth to have been made by nature. Edmund took a few steps that were not sure of themselves and heard the echo of his boots in strange ways, as if the space had impossible acoustics. Edmund stopped dead in his tracks when he saw the structure in the middle of that underground hall. It was a structure made of stone and metal that were intertwined to make something that looked like an observatory but didn't follow the rules of geometry. Under the flickering light, metal arches shone with a coppery color. They were held up by black stone pillars that looked like the column he had seen in the upper chambers. There was a perfectly round, circular hole in the floor right in the middle of this building. Carved steps spiraled down to depths that Edmund couldn't guess. He came up to him with both respect and fear. There were more symbols on the walls around the hall, but they were different from the ones he had seen before. They were bigger, more detailed, and seemed to tell a story through pictures that Edmund began to figure out as he walked around the room. The symbols showed people doing some kind of ritual around buildings that looked like the one in front of him. They showed the ground opening up, with something coming out or being sealed. The pictures were too vague to be sure. Edmund saw something strange in the pictures. The people in them changed as the story went on. At first, they were very different from each other, but over time, they became less distinct, and their shapes blended together. By the last panels, it was impossible to tell where one ended and the other began. And in all of the last panels, one thing was clear: the central structure, which the artist had shown with layers and layers of concentric marks, shone with a brightness that was impossible to miss. He looked back at the round opening. The spiraling steps went down in a way that was almost hypnotic, making him want to go down again. Edmund knew he was running out of food and that his lantern wouldn't last much longer. He also knew that no one knew where he was. It was wise for him to go back, write down everything he had seen, and come back with the right tools and people. But something in that place made his will stronger. He slowly started to go down the steps, using one hand to touch the inside wall of the spiral to keep his balance. Edmund could swear he felt a pulse coming from the stone here, regular and deep, like a buried heart. It was hot, almost feverish. Different symbols appeared on the steps with each full turn of the spiral. Some he recognized from the manuscripts, while others were completely new. He tried to remember them because he knew he might not get another chance to write them down correctly. It felt like the descent would never end, but Edmund finally made it to the bottom. What he found there made him speechless. The room was small, almost cozy compared to the hall above. The walls were made of clear crystal, not the greenish crystals from the upper chambers. The crystal reflected and refracted the light from his lantern in 1,000 different ways, making a kaleidoscope of moving shadows. There was something in the middle of this crystal room that shouldn't be there. It was a mirror, but not a new one. It was an old one made of a metal alloy that Edmund didn't know. It wasn't silvered glass that reflected the light. It was something darker that looked like it was almost liquid. The mirror was on a fancy stand that held it at a right angle to the floor. Around it, on the crystal floor, were more of those manuscripts. These were written with an almost frantic urgency, with the words rushing past each other. Edmund grabbed the closest manuscripts and started to read them in the dim light. The texts talked about a last discovery, something the group had found while looking into the crystal's frequencies. They had learned how to tune their minds to the mountain's vibrations, and in doing so, they realized they weren't alone. There was something else there, something that had always been there, waiting for people who could see it. The manuscripts called this mirror a portal, but not in a physical way. People who looked into it with a mind that had been properly prepared by hours of exposure to better crystals would not see their own reflection, but reflections of possibilities, paths not taken, and versions of themselves that had made different choices at different times. The group was so obsessed with these visions that they spent whole days staring at the mirror, trying to figure out the endless maze of alternate realities it seemed to show. But things had started to go wrong. The manuscripts got more and more broken up, saying that group members started to not recognize each other, and that the person in front of them was not who they said they were, but a different version of themselves, a reflection that had crossed over. Philosophical talks about identity turned into more and more paranoia. If every choice made a new version of you, which one was the real you? Which one had the right to be in this reality? Edmund felt a chill run through him as he read the last entries. The tone changed completely, becoming a desperate cry. The last person to write those words begged anyone who found that place to break the mirror, seal the rooms, and forget that it ever existed. But there were no instructions on how to do this, or an explanation of what had happened. The words just stopped, and the manuscript went on with blank pages. Edmund put the manuscripts away with shaking hands and finally let his eyes go completely to the mirror. He had been avoiding looking directly at it and only seeing it out of the corner of his eye until that point. But now, in that clear room with only the flickering light of his lantern, he couldn't resist the pull of that impossible thing any longer. At first, the mirror showed him exactly what it should, his own tired, dusty face looking back at him with a mix of interest and fear. But things started to change when Edmund got closer. The dark surface moved like water that had been disturbed by a stone that couldn't be seen. His reflection shook and changed shape, and for a moment, Edmund was sure that the person in the mirror was not moving in the same way as him. He blinked hard, blaming the difference on how tired and stressed he had been for the past few hours. But when he looked in the mirror again, it showed something else. He still looked like himself, but there were small differences in his face and posture. The Edmund in the mirror wore clothes that were a little different, had a scar that the real Edmund didn't have, and his eyes had an expression of knowledge that seemed to come from years of experience. Edmund instinctively pulled away, but his eyes stayed on the mirror. The picture didn't follow him. The other Edmund just stood there, staring at him with a disturbing intensity. Then, slowly, the reflected version raised a hand and pointed to something that the mirror couldn't see. Edmund really wanted to look in the direction that was pointed out to him, but something in his gut told him it would be a deadly mistake to do so. The surface of the mirror rippled again, and this time many images appeared at once. Each one was a different version of Edmund, with slight differences between them. One wore formal clothes from a time that seemed more advanced than 1902. Another had a face that showed signs of suffering that Edmund had never experienced. A third smiled with a joy that seemed strange compared to the real Edmund, and they all looked at him with the same creepy intensity. Edmund tried to move away, but his feet felt like they were stuck to the crystal floor. Something more subtle than a physical force was holding him back, a gravity that pulled not his body, but his mind toward those impossible images. He could feel his mind stretching as it tried to take in all those different versions of himself at once. It was both interesting and scary. At that point, he started to figure out what had happened to the group. They hadn't really disappeared. They had just gotten lost in the reflections, and their minds had become so fragmented among so many versions of themselves that they no longer knew which one was the original. Edmund could feel it happening to him now. His sense of self was starting to fade at the edges, blending with the memories and experiences of the other Edmunds who were watching him from the other side of the mirror. Edmund had to use a lot of willpower to close his eyes. The dark was a quick relief, like jumping into cold water after being in the hot sun for hours. He took a deep breath and focused on the physical sensations in his body. The weight of the backpack on his shoulders, the hard ground under his boots, and the smell of kerosene from his flashlight. These were real, physical things that belonged to this version of reality. When he finally got up, Edmund quickly pulled back, keeping his eyes away from the mirror. He had to leave that place. He had to get away from that thing that broke all the rules of nature that he knew. But as he rushed up the spiral stairs, one question kept coming back to him. How many of the other versions of himself in the reflections had also found that place? How many people were stuck down there, looking at the mirror and seeing more and more versions of themselves in an endless cycle of reflections? He got to the top hall, out of breath, with his lantern shaking violently in his hand. The big room felt different now, like there was something there that Edmund hadn't noticed before. It wasn't a physical presence, but a feeling in the air, as if the space itself were watching him and judging him. Edmund rushed across the hall, eager to get to the narrow tunnel that would take him back to the upper floors. But when he got to where the tunnel entrance should have been, he only saw a solid wall. Edmund ran his hands over the rocks, looking for the hole he had just come through with all his might. It couldn't have been that confused. He had walked straight from the main building. The entrance should have been there. but there was only rock, as if the tunnel had never been there. Panic started to set in, cold and real. Edmund made himself breathe slowly and think clearly. The mirror may have made him lose his sense of direction. He walked around the hall in a methodical and careful way, shining a light on each wall to look for any sign of the passage. But he didn't find anything. There were no breaks or openings in the walls, except for the central structure with its spiral staircase going down. Edmund sat on the floor and tried to stop the shaking that was going through his body. There had to be a logical reason for it. Maybe that hall had more than one entrance, and he just needed to look more closely. Or maybe being around the crystals for a long time was messing with his mind, making him see walls where there were passageways. He just had to stay calm, save his light, and look around in a methodical way until he found his way back. But as the hours went by and his lantern slowly ran out of power, Edmund had to face a scary truth. He wasn't just lost. Since he last looked in the mirror, something had changed at its core. The hall looked the same, but it felt different, as if he had crossed an invisible line and was now in a slightly different version of the place he had entered. He looked at the symbols on the walls again, looking for differences that might back up his theory. And there it was, subtle but clear. The panels that showed the people merging now seemed to have one more figure than he had seen before. A figure carrying something that looked like a lantern. Edmund's stomach hurt. It was like the symbols were changing in real time, adding their own story to the old story that was written on those walls. He went back to the main building and looked at it from every angle. The black stone pillars looked like they were pulsing with a faint inner light, maybe because he was so close, or because he was feeling so many things. Edmund remembered manuscripts that talked about how crystals changed frequencies and perceptions when people were around. Could the whole building be some kind of amplifier that makes the effects he felt in the upper chambers stronger? Edmund touched one of the pillars very carefully. The stone was warm, and when his fingers touched it, he felt something move through his arm. It wasn't electricity, but a feeling of recognition, as if the structure had been waiting for him. He saw pictures in his head, but they weren't his own memories. They were pieces of something older. He saw the people who had built that place, and how hard they were working deep inside the mountain, almost like they were fanatics. He also saw the moment they found the mirror, which was buried much deeper than any of them could have dug. Edmund was shocked to learn that they hadn't made it. They had only found something that was already there, hidden under layers of rock and time. The mirror was there before the group, and maybe even before any people lived in those mountains. It wasn't the only one. The pieces of vision showed other places and mountains around the world, each guarding something similar. It was like they were points in a global network of something that Edmund couldn't put into words. He quickly pulled his hand away, which broke the connection and made him feel dizzy. The light on his flashlight flickered as the flame burned up the last of the kerosene. Edmund knew he might only have a few minutes before he was completely in the dark, and the thought of being there for hours or days without light was too scary to think about. He had to choose. He had two choices. He could keep looking for an exit that didn't seem to exist anymore, using up the last of his energy and light in a possibly pointless effort, or he could go back down, back to the mirror chamber and try to figure out what was really going on. Maybe the way out wasn't real, but it was in your mind. Maybe he needed to find the part of himself that was still in the outside world and somehow get his mind back in line with it. The idea was crazy, because it went against everything Edmund thought he knew about reality. But it was also clear that something strange was going on. He had crossed a line, and the laws of physics didn't seem to work the same way anymore. Edmund thought about the group that had come before him and how they had carefully written down everything they found until it was impossible to write down anything else. They had figured out something he was just starting to see. Edmund made up his mind as the lantern flickered and threatened to go out. He would go down again, but this time not as a scientist looking for answers, but as someone who was trying to find his way back home. He started to go down the spiral stairs, counting each step to keep his mind on something real and solid. The stone under his feet vibrated with that steady pulse, and Edmund let himself breathe in time with it, which put him in a state of almost meditation. When he got to the crystal room, his lantern finally went out. The flame flickered one last time before going out completely. But Edmund found out that he wasn't completely in the dark. The crystals on the walls gave off a faint glow that was strong enough to show the basic shapes of the room. The mirror, on the other hand, shone with its own light. Its dark surface was now glowing with a silver light that seemed to pulse in time with the structure above. Edmund walked up slowly, taking each step carefully and on purpose. This time, he wouldn't turn away. This time, he would face whatever that thing showed him, because he knew it was his only chance to figure out what was going on, and maybe, just maybe, find a way back. He stopped a few steps from the mirror and made himself look straight at it. What he saw made him dizzy. This time, it wasn't a bunch of different versions of himself. It was just one picture, but it was too complicated to understand completely. It was Edmund Whitmore, but it was also the whole group that had come before him. It was everyone who had ever looked into that mirror, their minds and identities mixed together in a way that made it impossible to tell who was who. And in the middle of it all, there was something else, something that wasn't human, something that had been there long before anyone went down there. Edmund finally got it. The mirror didn't show different realities or possibilities. It showed links. It showed how all the minds that had ever been there were connected in ways that went beyond time and space. And by looking at it, really seeing it, Edmund was joining that network and becoming part of something much bigger and older than he could have ever imagined. The last thing he felt as Edmund Whitmore was a mix of fear and awe. Then the lines that defined who he was started to blur, and he became part of something that had no name and lived deep in the earth, waiting for each new consciousness to come down and find him. But there was something inside of Edmund that fought back. That spark, which was a big part of his mind and made him who he was, wouldn't let itself be completely absorbed. It was like holding on to a rock while a strong current tried to pull him away. His fingers slipped, but he still held on to the rock. Edmund could sense other minds around him, speaking in languages he shouldn't have understood but did, sharing memories that weren't his but were now part of him. A man named Thomas had come down there in 1863 to escape something terrible happening in the world above. There was a woman whose name has been lost to time, but she loved astronomy so much that she explored the depths of the earth with the same passion that others explored the heavens. The whole group of 1847, whose individual identities were now impossible to tell apart, merged into a single consciousness that still held bits of their original goals. And there were many more, going back to times that Edmund couldn't understand, minds so old that they barely remembered what it was like to be human. They had all come there looking for something: information, safety, or answers to questions that the people of their time were not ready to ask. And they all saw the mirror, which wasn't really a mirror but something that the human mind couldn't think of a better way to describe. Edmund understood through the expanded consciousness he now shared that it was a point of convergence, a place where the lines between people, times, and even realities became so thin that they could be crossed. Edmund had a hard time keeping his sense of self while taking in all this information. He remembered his name and said it over and over in his head like a mantra: Edmund Whitmore, a geologist from Pittsburgh, who went into this cave in 1902 to look for rock formations, and found a lot more. In real life, these were his coordinates and the things that kept him grounded. And even though part of him wanted to give in to the transcendent experience of being multiple, of existing in so many forms and times at once, Another part of him still desperately held on to the fact that he was only himself. This resistance is what finally broke the spell. The mirror flickered, and its surface shook violently like water in a storm. Edmund felt the other minds pull back, not with anger, but with something that could be respect or maybe recognition. They had put him to the test and found something strong enough to stay together. He wouldn't just be another thread in the tapestry. He would be something that kept its own color and texture even as it was woven into the bigger pattern. The crystalline chamber started to move around him, but not in a physical way. Edmund realized that he could see several layers of space at once, like sheets of glass stacked on top of each other. The room was empty, except for him and the mirror, just like it is now. The chamber looked the same as it did when the 1847 group worked there, with tools lying around and voices echoing as they talked passionately about what they had found. There was the chamber in the future, partially falling apart, and it had technology that Edmund didn't know about when he looked in the mirror. And there were even stranger layers, versions of the room that seemed to exist in different shapes, with walls that bent at angles that made his eyes hurt to try to follow. Edmund started to see paths between all of these layers. These weren't real tunnels. They were ways to move between the different versions of reality that all met at that one point. And, finally, he figured out how the group had gone missing. They hadn't died or been destroyed. They had just gone their separate ways. Each member eventually found a version of reality that fit better with who they had become after seeing the mirror. Edmund could do the same thing. He could pick any of those layers and follow it, which could take him to a different time or place, or even a different version of himself. There was a lot of temptation. He saw himself as a respected professor at one point, sharing his findings with students who were interested. In another, he lived alone in the mountains and kept the secret of that place like a treasure. There was even one where he had never gone into the cave and was living a totally different life without knowing it. But which one was real? Which Edmund was the real one? The answer that came wasn't in words. It was in direct understanding. All were real, and none was more true than the others. Reality was not a single line. It was an infinitely branching web of choices. Consciousness was what moved between them, choosing which path to take at any given moment. Most people didn't understand these choices because the paths were so similar that the changes weren't noticeable. But at this point of convergence, the differences grew stronger until they could be seen. Edmund closed his eyes to block out the overlapping layers of sight that were about to drive him crazy. He had to make a choice, but not at random. He needed to get back to the Edmund who had come down there, the one who still had a life waiting for him in the world above, who had records and notes in his hotel, and who would eventually have people looking for him when he didn't come back. He wanted that path not because it was more real than the others, but because it was the only one he thought was really his. This time, he didn't reach out to the mirror. Instead, he reached out to the air between him and the surface that reflected him. His fingers brushed against something that shouldn't have been there, a texture that felt both solid and fluid, hot and cold. Edmund realized that the substance was what separated the layers. If he could learn how to shape it, he could make his own path instead of following one that already existed. The crystals on the walls started to glow more brightly, as if they were responding to his will. Edmund felt energy flowing through him, but it wasn't his own life force. It was something that came from the mountain itself, or maybe from all the minds that had joined that network over the years. They were helping him because they saw how determined he was to keep his own identity while still being part of the larger whole. Edmund started to weave a path with a lot of hard work. He could see the spiraling steps, the narrow tunnel, and the room with the greenish crystals. He could picture every place he had been on his way down, but he didn't see them as they were now, in this layer of reality where he was stuck. He saw them as they were when he first crossed them, When he was still very much in touch with his own timeline, the mirror responded to what he wanted. Instead of reflections, its surface began to show projections, pictures of the places Edmund was trying to get to. And as he focused more and more, the pictures became more than just pictures. He could feel those places, as if he were in the crystal chamber and in those other places at the same time. He felt like he was being pulled in different directions, and his mind became clearer, like a thread that had been pulled to its limit. Then, something broke. It didn't break, but it did open, like a door that had been locked and finally turned on its hinges. Edmund felt himself being pulled through the layers of reality he had learned to see, but not in a physical way. The movement happened in an instant and lasted forever, taking both a moment and an infinite number of moments. When the feeling of movement stopped, Edmund was back in the room with the greenish crystals. But things were different. He was not the same. He knew that he still had pieces of the experience he had gone through deep inside him, memories that weren't all his own, and understandings that were bigger than what one person should be able to understand. It was like he had grown to fill a bigger space, and then shrunk back down to his original size, but now all of those experiences were folded up and stored inside him. He looked at his hands, which were shaking, but not because he was scared. It was more like he was in awe of them. He had seen something that went against everything science had built to explain the universe, and now he had to figure out what to do with this information. He could try to write it down, to turn something that was hard to put into scientific terms into something that was easier to understand. Or he could keep it a secret and let that place stay hidden deep in the mountain, safe from discovery. Edmund walked slowly through the room, running his fingers over the walls where the symbols were still faintly glowing. He could now read them, not with his eyes, but with the new knowledge he had gained. In the usual sense, the symbols weren't a language. They were maps that helped people find their way through the layers of reality that came together in that place. Each symbol was a message, a warning, or a note left by people who had been there before to help people who would come after. One symbol stood out to him. It looked different from the others, newer, and the stone around it wasn't as worn down by time. Edmund knew right away that it was one of the symbols he had seen in the later manuscripts of the 1847 group. It was both a warning and a promise. The warning was clear. Going too deep or looking too closely in the mirror could mean losing your sense of self completely. But the promise was just as clear. Those who could stay true to themselves while being in union would always have a deeper understanding of what life is all about. Edmund knew he had to climb. He turned off his lantern, but he found he didn't need it. The crystals reacted to him in a way they hadn't before. They lit up as he got closer and dimmed as he passed, making a path of light that naturally led him to the exit. It was as if the mountain knew he had passed some kind of test and was now helping him get back to the outside world. The tunnel that would take him back to the upper chamber was right where it should be. Edmund wasn't surprised to find it, even though he had looked for it before and not found it. He realized that the tunnel had always been there. He just hadn't been in the right layer of reality to see it. Now that he knew how to move between the layers, he could just pick the one where the exit was open. Edmund thought about the group that had come before him as he climbed. Now he knew why their manuscripts ended so suddenly. Not because something bad had happened, but because they had gotten to the point where writing didn't make sense anymore. How could you put into words an experience that went beyond the normal way of seeing time and space? How could you explain to someone who had never experienced the union of consciousness what it meant to be both yourself and a part of something much bigger? He got to the room with the black stone column in the middle, where he had found the first manuscripts. The room felt smaller and less interesting now, but the symbols on the walls still had their secret meanings. Edmund picked up the notebook where he'd carefully written down his first discoveries and flipped through the pages. His notes now seemed childish and shallow, as if they only touched on the surface of what that place really was. He thought about writing down new things for a moment, trying to capture something of what he had been through, but his hands didn't move on the blank paper. The words that came to mind weren't enough. They were too simple and twisted the truth instead of making it clearer. Maybe it was better to leave the mystery alone so that everyone who went down there could find their own way without being affected by the wrong ideas of those who came before them. Edmund put the notebook away and kept climbing. The air got fresher with each meter he climbed, and he could feel the surface getting closer by the change in pressure in his ears. He wanted to be outside, in the sunlight and the open sky. But the other part, the one that had changed because of what had happened in the depths, was sad to leave that place. He felt like he was leaving behind a part of himself, or maybe more accurately, the realization that the self was much bigger and more complicated than he had ever thought. When he finally got to the cave entrance, the light coming in through the opening seemed blinding, even though it was late afternoon and the sun was already low on the horizon. Edmund blinked a lot because his eyes needed time to adjust after being in the dark for so long. He came out of the cave and took a deep breath of the fresh mountain air. The cold wind hit his face, which was covered in dust and sweat. The Appalachian Mountains stood out against the darkening sky as he looked out over the Valley of Oblivion. It was as if the outside world had stopped while he lived for an eternity in the depths. Everything looked just like it did when he went down. But Edmund knew he was not the same man who had gone into that cave. He now had memories that weren't his own, knowledge that went beyond what he learned in school, and a constant feeling that reality was much more fluid and changeable than the science of his time was willing to admit. He started to walk back along the path that had brought him there. His steps were automatic because his mind was still processing everything that had happened. Edmund knew he would have to make tough choices in the next few hours and days. Should he tell the scientific authorities about what he found? Should he show other people the way there so they could also go through what he had? Or should he close off the entrance, burn his maps and notes, and let the cave go back to being forgotten, where he had found it? He could hardly begin to figure out what would happen with each choice. If he told people about the mirror and the deep chambers, people would come to see them, and that could turn that sacred place into a show, with people coming without knowing what they would find. But if he didn't say anything, he would be keeping people from learning things that could completely change how they think about consciousness, reality, and what it means to be alive. Edmund walked for hours through the thick forest, relying more on instinct than on his memory of the path. He finally saw the faint lights of the small village where he had set up his base camp after it was completely dark. The wooden huts looked fake after he had been so deep underground for so long. They looked like sets from a play that were meant to make it look like there was civilization in the wild mountains. He got to the inn where he had rented a room and quietly climbed the stairs, staying away from the main hall where some locals were drinking and talking quietly. Edmund wasn't ready to talk to other people like a normal person. He still had that sense of being more than just one person at the edges of his mind. He needed some time alone to get back to being himself and learn how to live again with the limited view of a single mind in a single body. Edmund turned on a lamp in his room and sat down at the little wooden table by the window. He could see the jagged shapes of the mountains through the dirty glass against the starry sky. He thought, it was down there, buried under layers of rock and time. The mirror was still there, that impossible meeting of minds and worlds, quietly pulsing in the dark while the world above didn't know it was there. Edmund opened his notebook and stared at the blank pages for a long time. He stood there with his pen hovering above the paper, trying to find the first words that would help him explain what he had been through. But every sentence he thought of sounded wrong, too simple, and unable to capture the heart of what he had been through. How could he explain what it was like to be both himself and a lot of other people at the same time. How could he explain that he had touched something that wasn't part of the normal flow of time? Finally, he started to write, not a scientific account, but something more like poetry. Words that suggested, rather than defined, that pointed toward truth without trying to trap it in strict definitions. He wrote about going down through the chambers and the symbols that were more than just decoration and less than language. He wrote about the group from 1847 and their efforts to map the unmapeable. He wrote about the mirror that wasn't really a mirror and the network of minds he had found connected deep down. But while he was writing, Edmund realized he was making something dangerous. His words were still a map, no matter how carefully he chose them. Maps drew explorers. If he published it or even just parts of what he had found, other people would come. Some would look for knowledge with respect and care. Some people would come out of morbid curiosity or a desire to see something shocking. And Edmund was afraid that some of them would come with plans he couldn't even begin to understand. He thought again about the warning he had read in the older manuscripts. Go no further down. Now he knew that it wasn't a warning about physical danger, but about danger to his very being. Going down to the mirror could mean that you would never be the same person again. It was facing truths about the nature of consciousness and reality that most minds weren't ready to handle. Edmund had made it through the experience while still being himself, but he knew he had been lucky or had some special quality that had kept him from completely falling apart. What other people would be able to handle that? How many would be lost, not in the sense of dying, but in the sense that they would be so broken up into so many different versions of themselves that they would never be able to put them back together. Edmund quickly closed the notebook and decided not to publish anything. He wouldn't show anyone the way there. He would let the cave go back to being forgotten, safe in its own darkness. But even though he made that choice, a part of him wondered if he had the right to do so. He didn't own the knowledge he had gained. It was part of a bigger picture, an understanding that people may have needed, even if it hurt, even if it changed how they thought about their own lives. Who was he to keep the whole species from knowing such deep truths? Edmund stayed up all night arguing with himself and thinking about every side of the problem. By morning, he had dark circles around his eyes and his hands shook from being so tired. But he had made up his mind. He would write down everything, every little thing he could remember, but he wouldn't publish it right away. Instead, he would seal the papers and leave instructions for them to be opened only decades later, when people might be better able to handle the news. Edmund admitted that it was a compromise, and probably not a perfect one, but it was the best he could do with what little he still knew. He would spend the next few days carefully writing everything down, making diagrams of the symbols he had seen, and mapping the chambers as best he could remember. But the papers would be well protected, kept hidden from anyone who wanted to see them until the right time came to show them. Edmund got up from his chair, which his muscles didn't like after sitting for a long time, and walked to the window. The sun came up over the mountains and painted the faraway peaks in gold and red. The cave was waiting for them somewhere out there, hidden under one of those rocky hills. The mirror kept showing its impossible things in the dark, and the minds that were connected to it stayed awake, guarding secrets that went against everything people thought they knew. He thought about whether or not he would ever come back. Part of him wanted to go down again, to explore more, and to try to understand better what he had touched. But another part of him, the part that was still trying to stay together as a whole person, knew it would be dangerous. It would be harder to come back each time he went down. Every time he looked in the mirror and saw the forces coming together there, it would make his sense of who he was weaker. Edmund had breakfast alone in his room, still not talking to anyone else. He had to learn how to act normally again to hide the huge emptiness he felt inside. He couldn't let what had happened to him show, not without raising questions he wasn't ready to answer. He had to remember how to be just Edmund Whitmore, an ordinary geologist looking at interesting rock formations, not Edmund Whitmore, who had touched the many lives that were connected and come back changed. Edmund set up a schedule for the next few days. During the day, he went to other parts of the mountains where he collected samples of common rocks and took regular geological notes. He admitted that it was a show, a sham to keep up appearances, but it was also necessary. He needed to get back to normal and practice being himself again. He worked on the secret papers at night, locked in his room, writing down memories and ideas that no one would see for decades. The process of writing things down was both helpful and painful. He felt like language wasn't good enough every time he tried to put into words what he had been through. It was like trying to paint a sunset with only gray paint, or describe a whole symphony with only 3 notes. Words were such limited, straight-line tools that they couldn't show how many different things he had seen at the same time. Edmund, on the other hand, kept going. He wrote not because he thought his future documents would perfectly convey the truth, but because writing helped him make sense of things. Every word he wrote down was like a stone in the structure of understanding he was trying to build for himself. And maybe, just maybe, when someone read those papers a long time from now, they would find something useful among the bad translations. After a week of being out of the cave, Edmund finally felt stable enough to act normally around other people. He went down to the inn's lounge and ate with the other guests. They asked him polite questions about his travels, and he gave vague answers about cool rock formations and geological samples. No one seemed to think he had found anything special, and Edmund felt guilty but relieved about that. But then, one of the older men, a hunter who had lived in those mountains his whole life, casually said something that made Edmund stop in his tracks. The man said that the natives who lived in the area before Europeans came had stories about sacred places deep in the earth where they could talk to their ancestors and see other worlds. The colonizers had called the stories superstitions, but the hunter thought there might be something real behind them. As the man went on, Edmund became more and more interested. He talked about how some explorers had reported strange things happening in certain caves in the area over the years. These weren't as dramatic as what Edmund had gone through, but they were clues, pieces, and hints that something strange was going on beneath those mountains. Most people thought these stories were just hallucinations caused by natural gases or an overactive imagination, but the hunter had his doubts. A few days later, Edmund left the village with his sealed notebooks and the knowledge that some stories were too big to tell right away. He went back to his life in Pittsburgh, but he was not the same man who had left. Edmund would close his eyes on quiet nights when the city was asleep around him and still feel that faint connection to something big and old that was hidden deep in the mountains. Years went by. Edmund kept working as a geologist, writing articles about normal rock formations, teaching at universities from time to time, and living a life that seemed perfectly normal to people who didn't know him, but people who knew him well could tell something was off about him. His eyes had a distance to them, as if part of his attention was always on something that no one else could see. He never told anyone what he found in the Valley of Oblivion cave. The papers he had written were still locked up, and there were clear instructions on how and when to open them. Edmund wasn't sure if anyone would ever find them or if they would just fade away like so many other secrets that have been lost over time. It didn't really matter, though. The real value of the experience wasn't in sharing it, but in having lived it and having that deeper understanding, even if he could never fully explain it. Edmund would sometimes go back to those underground rooms in his dreams. He would go back down the spiral stairs, find the mirror shining in the dark, and see all those minds looking back at him. And every time he woke up, there was a moment of confusion when he didn't know if it was Edmund who had dreamed of the mirror, or one of the many minds in the mirror that had dreamed of being Edmund. The cave is still there, hidden in a remote valley in the Appalachians. Its entrances are hidden by decades of plants and natural erosion. Maybe another explorer will find it one day, go down into its depths, and touch what Edmund did. Or maybe it will stay sealed forever, with only the quiet rock and time keeping its secrets safe. Once you open some doors, you can never fully close them again, but maybe some of them shouldn't have been opened at all. The Valley of Oblivion is a place where stories go to die and secrets sleep in the shadows of old mountains. Some people say that on very quiet nights, when the wind blows in a certain way through the rocky peaks, they can hear echoes of something that isn't quite sound. It doesn't resonate in the ears, but in the minds of people who are sensitive enough to pick it up. Edmund Whitmore kept his secret until the end of his life, a story that was too big to tell and too small to hold all of what it really meant. Maybe that's how it should be. There are some truths that only exist on the edges of language, hinted at but never fully revealed, and they are patiently waiting for those who are brave or foolish enough to look for them in the earth's forgotten depths. If you liked this trip through the dark and mysterious places that are hard to find, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel for more stories that push the limits of what is possible. Please leave a comment about what you thought of this disturbing story. Until the next one that will change how you see things.